The time is now, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. My name is Ali Hassan. I have the great pleasure of moderating this wonderful, very pertinent, very relevant session, which is being hosted by the Atlantic Council, an update on challenges to the democratic order, ladies and gentlemen. I couldn't ask for better speakers to indeed highlight these challenges that we're facing in this day and age. This is day 3 at the Munich Security Conference. Many of the challenges have already been laid out, and very much looking forward to elaborating on those. To my left, couldn't be more delighted to see her again, the former U.S. Secretary of State. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Madeleine Albright. I'm delighted to have with us the Canadian Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland, ladies and gentlemen, is here. And last but not least, we have the former Swedish Prime Minister, Carl Bildt, ladies and gentlemen, is here. Now, this is indeed, you'll get it back, Madam Secretary. This is indeed the declaration that we're talking about here. You should be having it laid out here on the floors. And to give you a bit of a purpose, give you a bit of a sense, give you a bit of a better understanding why this report was published, I'm more than happy now to call on the Executive Vice Chairman of the Atlantic Council and former National Security Advisor, Stephen Hadley. Stephen Hadley is also here. Please give him a hand. He's been... Give him a hand and a microphone. This is very pertinent because this obviously is a very important declaration. You are one of the co-chairs. Both Carl Bildt and Madeleine Albright have also co-chaired this. Stephen, what is this report about?
There's been a lot of discussion here. First, let me welcome everybody here to this town hall on behalf of the Atlantic Council. Great to have you come this morning. Look, there's been a lot of discussion at this conference about the pressure on the international system. As our host here at the Munich Security Conference said, the question is who's going to pick up the pieces of an international system under pressure. And we at the Atlantic Council, along with our Canadian partner, the Center for International Governance Innovation, want to start the answer to that question. And it starts with the principles on which a revised and adapted international order would be based. We're not turning our back on the principles of the old order, the commitment to democracy, freedom, human rights, rule of law, but trying to adapt those for the new situation. And that's what we've tried to do in this declaration. It has been adopted and signed on to by former officials of 20 countries, including India, Indonesia, and others. And it is a product of a process that involved consulting legislators, former officials, business, civil society, and also students to try to find a way to articulate principles in a way that will appeal to a younger generation. We thought it was appropriate time because there's a crisis of confidence in the West. Democracies have lost confidence in their own principles. As Madeleine says, it's time to renew our vows to those principles and start a campaign, which we want to kick off today, to try to get better understanding of those values and commitment to them as the basis for a new revised international order. Once we pulled the democracies together in defense of those principles, at the same time we want to reach out to others that do not necessarily embrace those principles, like Russia and China, and see if we can come up with a statement that is a common ground for a new revised international order. That's what we're about today.
That's what we're about today. Thank you so much. And indeed, this is a message that needs to be spread, not just only here at the MSC, but beyond, Madam Secretary. In your best-selling book, Fascism, A Warning, which came out last year, of course, you've already laid out many of those challenges and threats that we are facing to freedom, the open markets, and the rule of law. In your opinion, how severe is the current situation?
I think we are involved in a very severe situation due to many different things in terms of divisions in our societies, a question about justice and equality and who's responsible for making things better. I think there's a genuine question about the responsibilities of the governments and of the people to each other, which is why there's very specific language in this in terms of the role of governments and individuals and the private sector, because it takes everybody to make this happen. And I do think this is a very important time to do this, because I happen to think there is a crisis, and that I also have made the statement fairly frequently that age 70, people and organizations need a little refurbishing. So this is a very good time to renew our vows.
The vows and, of course, your commitment on that front is very much needed and appreciated, Minister Freeland. Autocratic powers are on the rise worldwide. We see it all across, even here on this particular continent in Europe. Your country has been somewhat immune from that. What advice can you give to those countries?
Well, I would start, Ali, by saying we don't think of ourselves as immune. What the Prime Minister likes to say is there is nothing magical about the air or the water in Canada that makes it, I mean, it is magical. If you're thinking about it as a tourist, it's like a fantastic place to come visit. But there's nothing magical that makes us immune to the threats that liberal democracies around the world are facing. And the Prime Minister likes to say Canada didn't happen by accident, and it won't continue without hard work. And at home, we really believe to continue to be a strong liberal democracy, to continue to be a country open to immigration, open to trade, strongly believing in the rules-based international order, and these are things we really believe in as a country. We have to work at it. And one of the things that I thought was the most powerful about your video and Stephen's introduction and what Madeleine had to say is this notion that, you know, democracy and the rules-based international order, it doesn't actually start at places like the Munich Security Forum with all of us talking to each other. It really starts at home. It starts, you know, I'm a member of Parliament. I represent a very defined piece of downtown Toronto. That's where democracy starts. And if our own people are not feeling that liberal democracy in our countries and the rules-based international order, including global trade, if that is not delivering for them, they are not going to support the rules-based international order. And so I really feel the first thing we need to do, and I'm speaking, you know, as an elected politician, I knock on doors and ask people to vote for me, is to be sure that people feel they have real opportunity for themselves and their children at home. And I do think, you know, your opening video said this, we haven't done such a great job in the past couple of decades in the rich Western countries of giving people that. So we shouldn't be so surprised that they're saying, you know, what have you done for me lately?
And Colville, indeed, if we look at this report and the co-chairs and the signatories, very, very prominent names, very, very high esteemed individuals. But at the end of the day, what would you say to people who say, well, that's wonderful that you came together in Munich for 3 days and signed this. Doesn't solve a single problem for me. This is the detached elite that is phrasing and putting together a report like that. What would your response be?
Okay, fine. It was wonderful to get together in Munich and sign these particular documents. I wouldn't deny that. But this is the result of a process and the beginning of a process. I mean, this is a document that has been issued. It's been discussed fairly widely in sort of, as you say, a fairly limited circle in terms of numbers of people. But we have tried to involve people from all over the world. And I think that's fundamental. Because if we go back to what happened sort of roughly 70 years ago, United Nations and the Charter of Human Rights and the Atlantic Alliance and the Council of Europe, it was fairly obvious at that time, after what had happened, that something like this was needed. That has been sort of decaying, forgotten and frayed at the margins, and we have a globe that is very different. The Atlantic world is still hopefully fairly important, but we needed to have a document that could be read and people could identify with in Brazil, in Nigeria, in Ethiopia, in India, in Indonesia. That's where the world is today, while it was only in the Atlantic world 70 years ago. So now it really starts, reaching out, inspiring, debating, listening to people who have objections, who want to change this particular document, because I think the process is, of course, much more important than the preliminary product that we have, and hopefully it will then result in a reaffirmation of some of these fundamental principles, but for a world that is much bigger much younger and much more dynamic than was the case 70 years ago.
Madam Secretary, there seems to be an elephant in the room at the end of the day. If we talk about an orange elephant, perhaps, in this particular case, if we talk about the assault on freedom, open markets, rule of law, and multilateralism, it doesn't take much to look at the current US president, who doesn't seem to believe in all these things. Now, that, of course, is a very dangerous sign. The president of the United States is undermining those values. What do you say to that?
No, let me say what I think is very important is if one reads our Constitution, the first article of the Constitution is about the role of Congress. And we have had the opportunity here, and many of us have already been up to our congressional delegations. They are the ones that need to understand this, and it has a lot to do, Krista, in terms of the political aspect of it and making it clear to people, to their constituents, about why this is important. And so I think in many ways it's Article 1 time, and we need to really focus on what members of Congress can do and do at home. I do think that it is important for our president and every president to understand that the United States has been and will continue to be a part of an international system of which we are leaders and beneficiaries, and that nobody's trying to take advantage of us, that what we need to do is to really bring this all up to date, as Carl said, and bring more countries in and the younger generation. And that this is an important thing to do at this particular time.
But would you say it's particularly dangerous if the president of the country, who's been promoting tirelessly and relentlessly freedom, also during your time, of course, is exactly undermining those values, if it's coming from the United States?
Well, I am concerned about that, and I've been concerned about some of the speeches that he's made at the United Nations. Primarily, I think one of the issues that's important to look at is kind of the combination of sovereignty and international obligation, and that one does not preclude the other. And therefore, every country does have a right to make its own rules. But given the kind of a world that we're in, it is important to see these as ones that are multilateral, that apply to many countries, and to get more countries involved in it. So I think that for us, and with the help of this incredible group of people, to have an action plan that how it is viewed in the United States is obviously important, but also how it's viewed in other places.
Minister Freeland, there seems to be a disappointment, to put it mildly, perhaps even cynicism with international institutions. We've seen the war in Syria is in its 8th year now. We've seen the atrocities being committed in Yemen or Myanmar, just to name a few places. Institutions like the United Nations and the Security Councils that were founded exactly to at least halt, prevent, and alleviate those situations are no longer working. They're being blocked by national interests. How do we revive that particular system? Does it need a new system, perhaps, even?
Well, I would say a couple of things to that. I would a bit challenge, Ali, the idea that they're no longer working. Were they ever working perfectly? No. And even I'm right now reading the Dean Acheson book, Present at the Creation. And by the way, his parents were both Canadian. Just a little Canadian footnote for everyone.
After the tourism pitch now.
Yeah, exactly,
wonderful.
exactly.
I like that.
And I think it's important for us to remember these institutions were imperfect from the start. How could they be perfect? They were created by humans. We've never had a perfect rules-based international order that prevented all war, that made everyone live in peace and security and liberty. One of the first things that happened, one of the first very early acts of the UN was to support the people of South Korea with the incursion from the north. And by the way, that isn't finished yet. There's still a UN command in Korea. The number 2 commander is a Canadian right now. But just hang on.
There are Swedes as well.
There's Swedes there too. Yes, Sweden is there also. We're all there. Americans are there as well. So
Right.
so just hang on.
Sure.
So these institutions are imperfect, and it was ever thus. Is it the case that there are new challenges we need to rise to meet? Absolutely. And I would agree with, you've mentioned 3 of the top ones. I think what is happening in Yemen is probably the greatest humanitarian disaster in the world right now. It is an outrage, and we have to work together to have this stop. On Myanmar and the Rohingya, Canada, our parliament has voted to declare this a genocide, and I do think we have to use that word. We've introduced sanctions against the generals responsible, and I think we really need to pay more attention there. Syria, I think, is actually, it's been a real failure of the international community, and we've let a lot of people down in Syria. But we need to kind of keep on going and keep on trying to fix things. You had pictures there of Ukraine and Venezuela in your opening video. Many of us who are here are working together on Venezuela, Canada in the Lima Group. It's now up to almost 50 countries who have recognized Juan Guaido as interim president. This is a real effort now that will succeed of the Venezuelan people to reclaim their democracy, partly because the rules-based international order and democracy-believing countries around the world are supporting them.
Right, but I have to come back because it does seem send a very wrong signal if those perpetrators who commit these crimes and crimes against humanity are not being held accountable. If people are using chemical weapons against their own people, if people are committing mass murder that leads to influx of refugees, they're not being held accountable internationally. You can kill a journalist in your consulates in another country and get away with it. So at the end of the day, this is what the people out there don't understand. Why aren't these people being held accountable?
Well, Canada is doing its utmost to hold these people accountable. We have referred the Maduro regime to the ICC. One of our big campaigns in Myanmar is holding accountable the generals responsible. That's why we've introduced Magnitsky sanctions. And you referred clearly to the atrocious murder of Jamal Khashoggi. And as a former journalist, I have to say, one of the institutions under attack around the world is an independent press. Canada is not satisfied with the explanations that have been offered to date about the murder of Khashoggi, and I do think full accountability there is absolutely essential.
Carl Bildt, if we look at the populist backlash that we're seeing in Europe and beyond, I see you already shaking your head. You have issues perhaps with that term. I'll give you an opportunity to respond. But at the end of the day, and even those of us who would defend democracy and uphold those values set forth in this particular document, even those would perhaps argue the system, especially economically, is not working. The former boss of Madam Secretary once famously said, "It's the economy, stupid." But if the world's 8 richest people have the same wealth as the poorest 50% of the country, would you agree then that the system economics is broken?
Well, I mean, that's a famous Oxfam figure that they release every year when the start of Davos. Is more a reflection of how property values develop. So it doesn't really reflect. The amazing,
well, we don't need to get hung up on this.
No. But the amazing thing is that I would argue that for the vast majority of people in the world, the system does work. I would argue that the period from, say, the late 80s and then 2 decades or perhaps a quarter of a century, if you take all indicators, reduction of poverty or child mortality or even democracy or getting rid of extreme poverty, it's probably been the best quarter of a century for mankind ever, the best quarter of a century for mankind. So from that point of view, yes, the system does work, but it takes time, doesn't work for everyone, and the more it works, the more we are aware of what remains to be done. I mean, Yemen, famine, horrors in Yemen. We are discussing Yemen all over the world. If we go to the generation of our parents or grandparents, I doubt they'd never ever heard of Yemen. It was so far away. Anything could happen in Yemen. No one cared because they'd never heard of it. Now Yemen is with us, and we are more aware of the remaining limitation, the remaining things that need to be done in the global system. So you can argue the other way around and saying that the fact that we see the failures in Yemen is a success in itself, because in the previous generation wouldn't even have cared about Yemen and these faraway places. The faraway places of which we know nothing, to take that particular phrase, particularly from Madam in that particular country.
Yeah.
We don't really say that any longer about very many places, and that's a good sign.
Well, still, social inequality, I think we would agree, not only in this particular circle, but beyond, is a problem. Social inequality worldwide. Migration, Madam Secretary, is another issue that fuels sentiments of xenophobia and hatred worldwide. An issue I know that is very dear to your heart because of your own personal background and biography, of course. Fears concerning about national identity is coming up. How do we address those concerns about mass influx of refugees and migration?
I think it is obviously one of the most important aspects. We were both born in different countries from where we are citizens now. And I do think that there has to be more attention paid partially to the humanitarian aspect of it, but also to what it does generally in terms of economic situations and social issues. And so I do think that people are dealing with it. And by the way, I do think the Canadians are outstanding in terms of dealing with this issue. And I have a report here that was just issued by the World Refugee Council. Lloyd Axworthy of Canada is one of the co-authors of it, and it is really a call to action on refugee issues. And it does fit into the Declaration of Principles, because Principle 6 is the right of assistance, which does affirm national sovereignty, but at the same time, it says allow citizens to receive assistance from others. And I do think that that is something that shows the interconnection of all of us, and that for humanitarian reasons, we have to deal with the whole issue of refugees. And for domestic issues, by the way, they are not a threat to anybody's nation or an emergency. So I do think that it is very important to deal with this in a sustained way, and to realize, and I think one of the aspects of the Atlantic Council work here is that what we want to do is link up with other organizations and have a call to action be much broader, and then bring the people in and get signatories for everything. And so it is definitely a basic document, but it needs a lot of help from others. And I do think the World Refugee Council is a good example of that.
Your microphone is sometimes going on and off, but that doesn't diminish at all the value and relevance of what you're saying. Minister Freeland, I saw you take diligent notes when the issue of migration come up and when the Secretary spoke. So, also someone who was not, indeed, was not born in Canada. Is this an issue that you would like to chime in here at this particular point?
Sure, and actually I was born in Canada, in a town called Peace River in northern Alberta, but neither of
your family is
of
originally from
my
Ukraine.
parents were born in Canada.
Yeah.
Yeah, you know, and thank you, Madeline, for saying nice things about Canada. That's our theme for
seems to be
today,
the theme
say
today.
nice things about Canada.
Carl Bildt, you know
You guys
you...
have to add that to the report,
Wonderful.
the principles.
Well-
It can be number 8.
Well, Carl Bildt, get ready. You know you're next with Canada report.
You could
so,
say nice things about Sweden.
Sweden
But
is okay.
Sweden is good. But look, when it comes to refugees, I think that it is important for us to appreciate that we have an international commitment to refugees. The Prime Minister, at the end of last year, made a formal apology in Parliament for a terrible moment in Canadian history when the Government of Canada turned back a boat of Jewish refugees during the Second World War. And that was an important reminder for all of us that you can come very easily to regret a moment of closing your door. And there was a famous line that was found in government documents of a Canadian public servant writing about this issue: one is too many. Some Canadian historians think that that moment and the historical research around it is actually what inspired Canada's welcome of the Vietnamese boat people. Because ministers and public servants at the time of the Vietnamese boat person crisis were thinking about that, and they thought, you know what? I don't want to be the minister, and I don't want to be the public servant who is the one is too many person around the Vietnamese boat people. And it actually led to an invention of something that has been so important in Canada and some other countries are starting to do, which is we have a system of private sponsorship of refugees. Refugees can come to Canada in two ways. They can be sponsored by the government, or they can be sponsored by individual private Canadians who spend their own money sponsoring the refugees for their first year in Canada. Groups come together, often but not only faith groups. And this is something that, some statistics have shown as many as 7% of Canadians have participated personally in sponsoring a refugee family. Some of the most moving moments with the welcome of more than 50,000 Syrian refugees to Canada has been people who came to Canada as Vietnamese boat people, getting together to sponsor Syrian refugees. And I think it's so important in countries, if you, as a political leader, believe that there is a responsibility to care for refugees, make it something that is not remote from the society.
And not remote from the society is exactly what I want to get at, Carl Bill. Before I give you the opportunity to praise Canada, I do want to point towards a very particular point. Obviously, this report, written beautifully, eloquently put, but you could say, okay, wonderful. This is a report, one of many that's coming out of these international gatherings. Now, how do you move now those principles? How do you now move from those principles to action? I think that's the challenge and the answer that we'd like to hear.
By the open debate, I would say. I think debates like this are important in order to focus issues, get people to think about them, and that leads to action in itself. Because these are, let's be honest, these issues are not entirely easy. If we take the issues of refugees and migration, we are now probably entering a new age of migration. The previous one was 19th century, created the United States and created Canada. There were some other people there before, but not very many of them. And we have more people of Swedish ancestry in Chicago than anywhere else in the world. So that was a huge wave that happened in the 19th century. Now we see other waves that are starting to appear. Is this an easy process? No, it's a complicated process because it brings up complex issues of identity, complex issues of understanding, complex issues of tolerance. And they can only be addressed by addressing them. Not saying that there are no problems whatsoever, because that's a bloody lie, but recognizing the problems and addressing them and then dealing with them. If I look, I don't look at German friends, I saw there was a report by another Stiftung, by the way, sorry about that, another German Stiftung out the other day, which had looked at the demographics of Germany and what's going to be the needs of the German economy in the next sort of 10, 20 or 30 years. This country needs a huge number of migrants in order to sustain its economy. Ukraine, a country that we deal with, has a declining population, needs new people to come in. Japan needs new people to come in. That raises issues that are difficult. And it's only by sort of discussing them openly that we can handle them. Not ignoring them, discussing them.
It's beyond doubt that we have a great deal of expertise here within this close circle, but also here in the stands, which I would like to make use of and come to you in just a second. But before, Madam Secretary, as one of the co-chairs, same question to you. How do we spread the word?
Well, I think by talking about it a lot, but also taking it out.
Just a second. Why don't we do it this way?
Okay.
Go right ahead.
Thank you. But taking it out and talking to the people and making it clear why they are the beneficiaries of it in various societies. I do think the Canadian approach about the private aspect of it is very important. And I do think also to make clear how much immigrants and refugees have added to the wealth and health of the countries. But it is going to require an active campaign. And I think that while we appreciate being able to come to meetings such as this, and all of us have made very clear that we need to reach out to people. We want to have a number of action plans. We're going to try to get, this was actually an idea of David Miliband from the UK, or now who heads the International Rescue Committee, that it would be a good idea if individual parliamentarians in all countries signed up for it. And then that would that bring some sense of a need to go out to the people to talk about it more? This is not easy. And it is, and none of us who've been involved in these kinds of things want it to sit on some shelf in our capitals. It has to, in fact, be taken out to the people, and it is a call to action of various parts of the world, as Carl said, but also the younger generation.
Call to action and the younger generations, which I see many of them here presented in the stands. Ladies and gentlemen, let's get you involved. Let's get you involved here. Karen Kornblum had her hand up first. We'll go by the order. I won't forget you. Karen Kornblum was just up, and we'll go right ahead.
Okay, thank you. Congratulations on this terribly, terribly important vision. And I wanted to especially congratulate you on calling out the disruptive effects of technology and the impact that it's had on societies. One of the big critiques, I think, of the liberal order is that it hasn't delivered as much as people hoped in the last few decades in terms of increasing standards of living. And you call that out. Obviously, and one of the things you talk about is the rising inequality, and you seem to call for a more robust social safety net, and then at the end you talk about the need for creative solutions, and I just think that's terribly important. It's been very hard for a lot of our economies to make those difficult decisions about political economy decisions, about taxation and social safety nets. And it's going to, obviously, the challenge is going to get greater with the impact of these new technologies like AI and robotics and so on. So I wonder if you think we can learn from each other. And I'm looking a little bit at Chrystia Freeland because she's written about these issues even before she entered public service. But I wonder if we can learn from each other. Canada's recently been experimenting with how to help its middle class and how to also have innovation. And if that's one of the ways that we can meet these challenges we've had a difficult time meeting in the past.
Thank you so much. Mr. Freeland, you want to take that?
Sure, and thank you for the question, Karen. As you know, I personally and very much our government is really concerned about income inequality and the hollowing out of the middle class. And I think we have to, I listened carefully to Carl's point about how overall we're getting richer and things are getting better, and I think that's absolutely true. But I think we also have to be very mindful of the fact that the middle class in many Western industrialized countries, including Canada, including the United States, including most of Western Europe, including Western Europe, over the past 20 or 30 years has had at least income stagnating, and by some measures, there have been people falling behind, especially manufacturing workers. And when you have a big part of your society experiencing that, and even more looking ahead to technological change, concerned that their children will not be able to maintain the level of prosperity of the parents, and may be falling behind, that's something that creates a huge amount of anxiety. And if you want to have public support for the kind of open societies we're talking about, open to trade, open to immigration, supporting multilateral institutions, people have to feel secure at home first. And I would say probably one of the most important things our government did immediately upon forming government was creating something called the Canada Child Benefit, which is paid directly to Canadian families with children. About 90% of Canadian families receive it. It is a tax-free benefit. It can be as much as $6,000 a year. And what we have found is 300,000 Canadian children have been lifted out of poverty because of it. Our belief is it's also had a real stimulative effect on the economy overall, because the marginal propensity to spend, the likelihood that when you get this benefit, you're actually going to go out and buy stuff from your local stores, is the most precisely in these families. So that would just be one example of a Canadian policy. I think all of us, and this must be sort of annoying to be Swedish, Carl, because when it comes to social welfare and social safety nets, we cannot but look towards Sweden and what you guys do. And we study the Swedish example a lot in Canada.
And that is, of course, based on the fact that we have an economy that works.
We do
Exactly.
too.
Yeah, you do too, but not everyone in the world does. I mean, if we talk about what's been happening in Europe, it's unfortunately the fact that we have a divide between the North and South. I mean, essentially Germany and everything north has been doing fairly well. We took a beating in 2008, 2009, everyone did, but most are back and well above that. But in the south of Europe, not the case. And that's where you have the problems. That's where you have the problem. And that goes to how you manage economies and things like that. You must have sort of a functioning economy to be able to do these sorts of things. And there are lessons to be learned in that particular respect. Canada has been doing well.
Madam Secretary?
I do
US
think
somewhat
it's
less.
important to learn from other countries.
Yep.
Our problem at the moment is that the executive, by the way, one of the hardest things for a former diplomat is to be abroad and criticize your own country. On the other hand, I do value my credibility. So I think that it is important to say our problem is that we don't want to learn from other socialist countries. And therefore, what I think is very important is for us to talk about this as a way of empowering people in a system that allows us to take the best. And one of the things that may surprise you is I'm very glad the political campaign has begun this far ahead of time, and that there actually are so many candidates in the Democratic Party, because we're going to have this discussion. And it's important to have it because, and then I hope we don't form a firing line in a circle, because we need a very strong candidate. But I think we really do need to talk about it. Because the proclivity is for us to criticize other countries, especially the two sitting here, in terms of their socialist approach.
Indeed. What do you make, if I may follow up, what do you make of rising political stars in the United States, such as Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez? And they make a lot of volume, is very present. It seems to be a trend and a movement that is starting amongst the Democratic Party. What do you make of that?
Well, I think that there are new people that have gotten elected, and what I have found very interesting is to spend time. I was, by the way, invited to go to a retreat that was organized by the Congressional Research Service for all new members of Congress. They came to this, they had their names and their states, but not their parties written down on their placards. And the bottom line was people wanted a new direction. They wanted to know what they could do. They were respectful of each other's views. They are getting organized. So I'm all for new people. I'm also for people that need to listen to others and recognize teamwork. But it's a very exciting time, and I welcome the fact that we are having a robust political discussion.
You've been very patient. Thank you so much. Go right ahead.
Thank you very much. Australia is, in my view, the most successful multicultural society in the world. Our population, our community has
direct attack in Canada.
no. But let me explain. I mean, obviously, as a former Prime Minister of Australia, I'm entitled to talk my own book and speak up for my own country. But we have just under 30% of our population were born outside our borders. And that is a very, very high population. In Sydney, for example, our biggest city, the number of people living there who were born outside Australia would be close to a third, and over half of Australians have one foreign-born parent. So it is a very multicultural society, and a very diverse one. It's our greatest strength. But one of the fundamental foundations that enables that to be politically acceptable and deliverable is that the government is seen to be able to control its borders. You cannot compromise on border security. If people believe that others, from whether they are, whoever they are, can just walk into your country, they will lose trust in your multicultural society. So border protection and border security is fundamentally important, and that enables a country, and it enables my country, to be able to have a very generous humanitarian program comparable to Canada's, but on the basis that it is the government elected by the people which determines who comes into the country, and that is the fundamental right. Let me make a couple of other points. And I just want to emphasise, uncontrolled migration is undermining democracies right around the world. And every government, whether it is on the left or on the right, has a vested interest and a commitment and an obligation, yes, to be compassionate and generous in humanitarian sense, but yes, to control its borders. Just one other point I want to make to put a couple of things in context. There are at least 65 million people, probably more, who could make a plausible claim for asylum, a refugee status. There are hundreds of millions of more people in the developing world who would have every incentive to get into a developed country for reasons, perfectly understandable reasons of economic advancement. The key that the challenge that we must face, and it's been a subject of discussion here in Munich, is we must ensure that peace and stability is returned to those countries of origin of asylum seeker flows and of economic disadvantage. And President al-Sisi of Egypt spoke about that very eloquently at the conference's opening. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We're quickly running out of time here. This is a very vibrant discussion that we're having. So I want to give you a chance. Please keep it brief so we can get a couple more voices in. Madam Secretary, you want to answer Mr. Turnboy? No, go ahead. You all get a chance.
I do think that every country has a right to have an immigration policy, and I think most of us have been saying that it's important for the United States to have a comprehensive immigration policy. But in the meantime, the way we are treating the people, I think, is un-American. And so I believe that there need to be appropriate discussions about this. And I do think we need to look at the Canadian model. I have some question about what the Australians are doing in terms of having people living in Papua New Guinea while they wait to figure it all out.
Carl Bildt.
Well, I salute both Canada and Australia as multicultural societies, but I would argue that the, by far, most impressive and biggest multicultural society is India. That's 1 billion people with a number of different religious faiths. And one of the lessons to be learned from India is that this would never have worked if it wasn't a democracy. A democracy is safe in India, which is going to be the world's largest country, because people understand that. If there were to be an authoritarian regime dominated by the one or the other belief, the country would explode and would not survive. So we should, that's why I think it's important to recognize that this document must fly also in places like India and Brazil and Indonesia and Nigeria. And both of these are, by the way, if you look at election campaigns, the biggest election campaigns underway in the world today is the Nigerian presidential elections and the Indian parliamentary election coming up in a couple of weeks, where all of these issues are debated. I agree with the Prime Minister, control of the external border, slightly easier in Australia, although I understand not entirely without its challenges, than in Europe. Because, and even Canada and the United States have a fairly good situation. We are separated from the Middle East, if we are separated from the Middle East, which I don't think we are, by the Bosporus. Nothing else. We are intertwined with the Middle East. We are neighbor of Africa. And at the turn of, or the end of this century, 40% of the working age population of the world is going to be in Africa, in our neighborhood. So these concerns are very real concerns.
And Minister Friedland, you've already spoken eloquently and extensively about the Canadian model, of course. I'm sure you have something to say.
Well, look, I won't get reelected in October if I don't take on Prime Minister Turnbull on the Diverse Society Australia Challenge. And
have a separate debate.
As fellow Commonwealth countries, we spend a lot of time talking with our Australian friends. But I will have to say, to your Sydney numbers, Toronto, where I am an MP, is 50% now born outside Canada. And 75% of the people in Toronto are either born outside Canada or have parents born outside Canada. And that speaks to Carl's political point, which is, in a democracy, a diverse society can be self-sustaining. One reason I think, I mean, we do have some efforts to sort of introduce a more kind of racist tone in Canadian politics, but so far they haven't caught on among any of the mainstream parties, because in a city where 50% of the people are born outside Canada, that is not a very politically viable platform. And so I think to Carl's point, democracy can be supportive of all of this. And I do also, because we're with our European friends, I do want to acknowledge, just so that we Australians and Canadians don't sound too sanctimonious. As Carl says, it's a heck of a lot easier for us because of geography. Our only land borders are with the United States. And we're quite pleased to have the world's longest...
And Denmark.
That's actually true. Very good. We have some border discussions with them. No, we have the world's longest unmilitarized border with the United States. And as people have been saying, it's true that one of the things which is essential to have public support for immigration, and we have high levels of immigration in Canada, more than 300,000 a year, is that people feel they have sovereign control over their borders and choose who comes in and who doesn't. That's essential.
Ladies and gentlemen, only 10 minutes until we wrap up. Now, we talked about bringing on board the younger generation, and well, let's make this real. We have a younger voice here. Please introduce yourself and be very, very precise and short, because we're running out of time.
Hi there, Arshad Marzani, Junior Ambassador here. As the panel has noted, never before has a U.S. president been so agnostic about the values in this. But I think what's very important to note is that the gap between these values and actions by the United States and other powers is not new. And including Secretary Albright during the Clinton administration, of course, when the actions during the Rwandan genocide and when sanctions in Iraq cost so many lives. And of course, I think that's even more dangerous in a way because credibility is power in foreign affairs. And when we act different from what we say, we undermine that credibility. So how do we make sure that we live up to these values not only now when this topic is in vogue, but all the time?
Indeed, the question that is looming around, how to move from principle to action. Before we wrap this up, we have the former Estonian president here, another signatory of this agreement. Let's bring it on.
Just quickly, having been born in Sweden, grown up in the U.S., and lived in Canada for 4 years, I'm actually surprised that you have not mentioned the most successful multicultural society, and that is the European Union, which has managed to do better than any other political entity in managing the differences among different nations. And I wish we would talk more about the European project and less about the failures across the Atlantic.
Right. So 2 voices from the younger generations. I love it. Let's, ladies and gentlemen, now the European Union. Minister, I know you have to depart fairly soon, so this is the final round. You all get to chime in and respond. I want to go with you first.
Let me start by responding to Thomas's comment. And since we are here in Europe, I want to say, speaking for Canada, we love the EU. No, we really do.
Well, in case you haven't noticed, Great Britain is leaving. We have a slot for you.
Well, we do speak both French
I'm going to
and
interrupt
English.
because the most revolutionary thing I did as Secretary of State was to move Canada into the Western Hemisphere because according to the State Department, it was in Europe. So
yes, I remember that. I remember that. No, but I do want to say one thing about the EU, a couple of things about the EU. So, we concluded recently a trade agreement with the EU, CETA. This was incredibly important for Canada. It's very important for us to diversify our trade, and it was also important as part of the principles that we've been talking about today, as a real statement at a time of rising protectionism, to say that Canada and the EU were capable of doing a trade deal and moving forward. And subsequently, we've done that with the TPP, moving forward together with our Japanese, Australian, and other partners in the Asia Pacific. So, we haven't really talked about the trade piece. But I would say when it comes to the rules-based international order and our global interconnection, it's really important to remain open to trading with each other. And I think that if we do our job of supporting our middle classes at home, of giving people confidence that the system is working for them, we can continue to live in societies that are truly open societies, open to immigration, which we've talked about a lot today, open to trade, and open to this notion that we do have an international responsibility to countries around the world, in part out of very naked self-interest. You know, we've been talking about, Carl quite rightly has pointed out that the world is smaller now, and a refugee crisis in Syria is something that can have very local and difficult effects all over Europe.
Madam Secretary, Secretary, we started with you. I want to finish with you this round. Carl Bildt, go right ahead.
No, just say, read the document, discuss it, raise objections, and take it out in your respective countries and in different parts of the world. Going back to what I said in the beginning, which I think is fairly fundamental. These were values very often founded 70 years ago in the Atlantic world. Fine, they've served us well. They're still relevant, but there are new issues, and it's a much different world. And we need to reach out to that and have these anchored much more globally than was the case before. It's only by doing that that we can be certain that they are perhaps respected somewhat more in the future. The word is not going to be, well, one would hope that Atlantic Council can make the word perfect in a week or two, but I think it's unlikely. But we can step by step, by having principles like these better anchored, step by step, perhaps making the world a slightly better place.
Yes, and I do think what is so important about these principles is they are a combination of understanding history and why they were created in the first place, and are they still relevant? And that is kind of the moving forward. And I think one of these, to answer the question, that I think is germane is the sixth one, is the right of assistance, because that kind of blends the issue of national sovereignty and those rights, and yet at the same time, when something terrible is going on in a country, isn't it the responsibility of the international community to do something about it? Much easier said than done. It is something that I have spent a lot of time on, either done right or been criticized for. But I do think that that is the new thing here. One could say that people didn't know what was going on during World War II. We now know everything that's going on everywhere, and therefore there is a responsibility, and that's why I think this sixth principle is a very important one.
Ladies and gentlemen, Declaration of Principles for Freedom, Prosperity, and Peace. There you have it, brought out by the Atlantic Council with many, many esteemed individuals. CG, of course, credit where credit is due. The point being that this work needs to be spread more than ever. 7 principles. For a minister, we'll add an 8th, visit Canada. That's the
perfect. I endorse that strongly.
There you go, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for your attention. Big round of applause for our individuals. Thank you so much.